That was a lot of definitions last week. A lot of stuff we covered. So now let's look at how we put it together a little bit more to create different types of synthesis. Really hope you didn't think there was only one type. So these are only going to be definitions. I'm just going to go over the basics of what this type of synthesis is, and then in class, we're going to spend all of our time creating these. We'll be looking at the classic examples, but there are other types like hybrid synthesis where you're using samples and using that to create different effects with synthesizer waveforms. There's wave field synthesis. There is wavetable synthesis, vector synthesis, spectral synthesis, and just others that we don't have the hardware or the software to cover due to the cost. The main types that we're going to look at are subtractive, additive, frequency modulation, or FM, physical modeling, and granular synthesis. So subtractive synthesis, or East Coast synthesis, is the most common type. It creates complicated waveforms by using multiple LFOs, VCOs, noise sources, all of which are modulating each other to get a rich sound, and then it filters out unwanted parts of that sound using filters. For the filters, you can use low pass, high pass, band pass, notch, Moog's classic ladder low pass filter, any type of filter. You can also use things like formant filters, which are used to emulate peaks in the spectrum similar to the human vocal tract, with included vowel shaping to open up, that type of thing. It works really good with saw waves too, as that's about the closest classical waveform that shows how air moves in a body. You can also use talk boxes and vocoders, where you use a tube or a mic running to the performer's mouth to control the shape of a filter. The mouth itself becomes the filter. And changes in the vocal cavity create a formant filter of a signal. Peter Frampton's Frampton Comes Alive is the classic example. Vocoders apply the spectrum of one signal to the signal of another. So it's closely related, but much, much cooler when using a depth control to morph the sounds. We will look at that in interactive computer music when we start playing with FFTs. A good example of a subtractive synthesis module would be pretty much anything by Moog. Reason's subtractor module, and Logic's ES2 synthesizer. Additive synthesis takes multiple waveforms and adds them together in harmonic or inharmonic relationships to get a complex spectrum or timbre. It's also called Fourier synthesis. But the big thing to remember is that you have to decrease the amplitude of all the partials above the fundamental, or you will just get chords and mud. Downside, it is very CPU intensive. You are typically running not just one oscillator per note, but 7 or 8 oscillators per note, and it has to calculate all of these. But you can get some really cool sounds. Buchla did this in hardware using wave shaping to create similar effects, even though it's slightly different, but it's playing with the harmonics, basically. There are some really good examples of this in software, specifically UVI's Falcon, and in Logic, the Alchemy synthesizer. Next, we get to probably my favorite, frequency modulation synthesis. Classically, you take the output of one or more VCOs and use those to modulate the frequency of another VCO. Once it's above 20 hertz, it stops sounding like vibrato, and you start to hear new pitches develop. And then depending on if you're doing this with linear or exponential modulation, you can get some really, really raucous and wild screaming sounds. So there are parts to frequency modulation. The carrier is the sound, usually the oscillator that is being modulated. The modulator is the sound that's doing the modulation. VCOs can be arranged in different numbers and configurations, but the classic technique is 2 sine waves. There's nothing to say that you don't have to use sine waves, though. You can use saw waves, you can use pulse width modulation, you could use another modulated wave. But classically, two sines. One modulates the other. For example, the Yamaha DX7 uses 6 variable type VCOs in different algorithms to control how they modulate each other before finally being output. Now, this type of modulation results in sidebands. These are partials spaced on either side of the fundamental, spaced by the frequency of the modulator. So if the carrier is 440 Hertz and the modulator is 110 Hertz, you'll have sidebands at 110, 220, 330, 550, 660, and 770 Hertz. But your fundamental is still going to be at 440 Hertz. Generally, if the carrier and the modulator are multiples of each other and follow that nice whole number harmonic series, then the sidebands will result in a harmonic spectrum. If they are not, and you're not multiplying by nice whole numbers, and you're multiplying, say, 440 by 374.2, then you're going to get an inharmonic spectra. It's going to be more metallic. It's going to be more harsh. But it could also be really interesting. You have to play with it to find out. So the pros and cons. The pros are that it is super efficient in order to create really complex spectra that change over the course of a note and are just really interesting to listen to. This is why I love it. The cons are that it is hellishly difficult to program, especially on the Yamaha DX7, which had a 2-line LCD. It was awful. Some examples of classic frequency modulation synthesis. There is the DX7, Make Noise's Dual Prismatic Oscillator, or DPO module, the Verbose Complex Oscillator, and Native Instruments FM8 software synthesizer. Physical modeling is a little bit newer. This is kind of a cool effect where it creates a mathematical model of a hypothetical instrument using waveguide synthesis, where digital delay lines and filters shape the sound, using lots of filters and a resonator model and different waveforms. So the advantage is you can create really cool sounds that are theoretically real or beyond real. Like, what would the sound of a 50-foot set of bagpipes be like? Physical modeling synthesis can answer that. The disadvantage is it takes a lot of CPU power, lots of audio horsepower, and you actually have to read the manual. But there are a couple that are built into different DAWs. There is the classic Karplus-Strong algorithm, which we'll dissect in interactive computer music, but Logic has the Sculpture synthesizer in there, which does physical modeling. You can change material type, you can change different resonator types. It's very fun. You can morph a lot of stuff. And in Ableton Suite, you have Tension, which does some really gnarly modeling of string instruments. Granular synthesis is another favorite of mine. This is a recent development. It was theorized in the 60s by Xenakis, but didn't really become feasible for most people until 2001 with Curtis Rhodes' research. The way that it works is that it takes a signal or a sound file, chops it into 5 to 50 millisecond grains, usually around that 20 millisecond range, and then plays them back in bursts. That can be either asynchronous, where you get this really gritty and irregular mass of noises, or synchronous, which will be a decent imitation of repitched voices or instruments, whatever you used as the sample file. It can also be used to process a sound using successive time windows to time stretch or pitch stretch without changing other aspects of the sound in real time. So there are a number of examples of these. The only hardware one you'll find is the Make Noise Morphogene. But in software, you'll find Reason's grain sample manipulator. In Falcon, they have the EarCam grain and multi-grain oscillators. And one of my personal favorite programs, EarCam Labs TS2, does amazing time stretching using granulation. Then in Ableton, you have grain delay, which, as I've said before, is hands down my favorite effect ever created for any DAW, period. Other types of synthesis. You have things like wavetable synthesis, where you are directly morphing multiple single waveforms in a stored lookup table to create an evolving spectra. These are actually making a bit of a resurgence in apps, among other things. Moog's Animoog is a great example of that, as is any of the apps from Wolfgang Palm. In Ableton, you have Wavetable, and then very popular with a lot of people, the Serum synth is wavetable synthesis. Another type is Wavefield, which we're not going to be looking at because I don't have that kind of cache. But it is a massive array of speakers with computer-controlled algorithms that allow for the positioning of sounds at very, very specific nodes, or of creating sounds that change timbre based on your physical location in proximity or inside of the speaker array. The composer Paul Kuntz has a lot of examples of these. I've been lucky enough to see a couple of his Wavefield pieces performed live. They are mind-blowing. Then we have spectral synthesis, which, time depending, we might be able to take a look at. This is deconstructing a sound into its constituent sine wave components, editing and using those to resynthesize the signal through the sum of sines. In Logic, you can do this in Alchemy, and then there's a very, very cool freeware program called Spear that you can use for this as well. But we'll have to see if we have enough time to actually explore those.